belonging and transcendence are the two things that humans have forever grappled with. And often belonging and adaptation slash evolution can be at great odds with each other, right? And so if you think of individuation that happens, and what that means for belonging, is you're trying to adapt and kind of grow into something. And at the society level, whenever a group of people want society to evolve, they have to create tension, or they have to name the tension that is there, that challenges some feelings of belonging. And that is so tough.
When I started to feel like I could call myself a process designer, because I had, on a personal level, I had transformed enough to let go of the need for clean, clear outcomes. It makes growth a strength. It makes learning something different and thinking about something differently actually a strength, as opposed to somehow you've compromised your own consistency or an integrity. It's okay, actually. It's a strength to change my mind about something or to feel differently about something, because that means I'm growing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Duncan Autry, and you are listening to Fractal Friends, the podcast where we explore our self-similarity across our diversity. We all have a role to play in the whole, and the purpose of this show is to interview people with interesting perspectives on the world and see what we all can learn from one another. In this episode, I talk with AddieRose MayerandEi Ei Samai. AddieRose and Ei are fellow conflict transformation professionals. AddieRose is the executive director at SEED's Community Resolution Center in Berkeley, California, and Ei is a culture designer at the Samai Group. In this conversation, we talk about how conflict transformation skills can be a powerful antidote to many of the social and political issues that we face today. And we talk about how living and thriving in diversity is amazing, but it is also hard work. We get into the important differences between deconstructing systems and transforming systems. And we talk about how we are able to consciously design the processes, systems, and cultures that work best for each and all of us. And we also talk about the important role of grief and grieving in any process of transformation. AddieRose, Ei, and I are friends as well as colleagues, and this conversation provides an intimate window into how we think and talk about our work, our lives, and the world around us. This episode offers a sense of possibility in the face of tricky challenges that are coming up on this season of Fractal Friends. Thank you so much for listening to Fractal Friends. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it, and please give it a review. You can also come visit the episode website at fractalfriends.us, where you can get information about AddieRose and Ei and learn more about the things that we discuss in this episode. I also encourage you to check out the archive of over 40 episodes, which are now organized by category. I'm psyched to say that it's possible now for you to support Fractal Friends. You can make a donation through PayPal, or you can become a patron of Fractal Friends through Patreon, where you can subscribe to make a contribution for each episode. You can find buttons to make contributions on the episode page or at fractalfriends.us. One last thing. I want you to know that I am professionally and personally dedicated to helping the world improve its capacity to communicate across our differences. At my company, Spoken Wheel, we work with teams, companies, organizations, all kinds of groups to help them transform their relationships with conflict and with each other. If you are part of any teams or groups that need support to be able to happily and effectively work together towards your life-affirming purpose, please get in touch with me. We offer free initial calls at our site, spokeandwheel.co. That's spokeandwheel.co. This conversation was recorded in late July of 2020. And now please enjoy this episode with AddieRose MayerandEi Ei Samai. Oh, Ei, AddieRose, I'm psyched to have you on the Fractal Friends. I love that you were both friends and colleagues and people I can share my conflict transformation work and personal life. And what I really hope about this conversation is that we'll have a chance to, one, just share with the world about what we see happening in the conflict transformation field, the kind of medicine that we think that it can bring into these times. But then also, talk about what we see in this work and what it means to us. And then, of course, just being close. I think it'll be a fun window into just like how our minds work, because I think that we can really connect on a nice level here. I would love to start by having both of you just kind of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your work as you see it. And we can use this as an opportunity to also start sort of defining some of the scope of this work, like what is conflict transformation, what is culture, what is mediation, dialogue, so we can set the conversation up a bit. You want to go first, kind of telling us who you are and what you do? Yeah.
Sure. Yes. In what, 30 seconds or less?
Mm-hmm. All the time you need.
Sounds good. My name is Ei Samai, and I call myself a culture designer professionally. And that's a term that I can't explain to most family members. It definitely doesn't, pass the test of like, can you say that to a middle schooler or your grandmother? So I will try to explain a little bit about what I mean by culture design. And it's a little tricky because culture is sometimes used to indicate like national or ethnic culture. But what I mean by culture is the things that are normal, like so normal to us that we don't even see it. So, a lot of the time, like our families, even if we grew up on the same neighborhood as another family, our little nuclear family has a certain culture, things that are norms, things that are taboos, like all of that is family culture. And then, of course, there is, culture that comes with your age group or your professional background or a certain culture inside an organization or workplace, the culture of like certain music, or even now, I would say, there's culture that happens on social media that might be different from how people are when they are face to face, so there's now a whole new set of norms coming up around what happens, when we meet over Zoom, for example. So I try to explain the work I do to my mother-in-law the other day, and I think I just thoroughly confused her. It's like the more I talked, the more she looked lost. And finally, she just said, "Can you just give me an example?" And I gave her an example. And I actually gave her 2 or 3 examples, but because the things on the surface are so different, for example, I could be working with an academic institution, or I could be working with a for-profit company, like those kind of typical how you describe your work labels don't really apply with me. It was still confusing. So I'll try to give you an example of the way that culture design has worked in my personal life. I grew up in Burma, and we don't have last names. It's just not a thing. And so when 2 people get married or when people have children, there's no discussion about what last name they get because there are no last names. People can have a name that's 1 syllable long, like my paternal grandfather. His name meant love, and so he was Mr. Love, Uche. And you could have names that are like 6 syllables long, and that's just normal. And my husband, he grew up in the United States, and he grew up in a family that has the family last name, that is patrilineal. So when we got together, we really wanted to examine that. I think especially because I come from a culture where I'm like, I'm not taking your last name. Why would I change my name, right? So the decision we made at the end was to pick a name that meant something to the both of us, that really signified that we are starting something new together, that we're creating this partnership intentionally, and that our hopes and goals and inspirations for our family are carried in the name that we call ourselves. So my name, Ei Samai, is not something that I was born with, nor is it my husband's. So Samai is a Quechua word meaning breath or spirit. And so it's really a reminder for the both of us to continually strive to live in spirit and, and really be aspiring towards something greater than ourselves. So that's an example of the way that culture can be examined and redesigned.
Thank you for the example and like that personal story. What I like there, especially as like translated into the work, is that first of all, culture is this thing that's invisible. It's like the water that the fish lives in. It's like not necessarily, it's something that's so implicit that it's hard to make explicit. But it's interesting what happens when you can bring something into the conscious mind and then actively say, is this working for me or is this not working for me? Ken Cloak, sort of another colleague, friend, mentor of mine, talks about it's like in any given conversation, if you're like in a conflict or something, you could just ask the group of people, is this conversation working for you? Right? And then you can start, and then people say no, and then you can open this door into like what's possible. So there's something about like, is this working? Even just thinking to ask that is already becoming a transformative experience. So I appreciate that a lot. AddieRose, you want to tell us a little bit about some of your work and how you see it in the world?
Absolutely. Thank you. Incredibly excited to be in this kind of a space with both of you. I think of you both as thought leaders and peer mentors. And I have a short list of accountability buddies, as I say, of people I need to call on to make sure I'm making decisions with integrity. And both of you are folks like that for me. So just professionally and personally. So really grateful for that. My name is AddieRose Mayer, and I professionally currently lead an organization in the Bay Area. We serve the Bay Area, all of California, and more recently have been invited to other parts of the country. And we're a conflict transformation capacity building organization. And what that means is that we support schools, workplaces, and communities to engage positively with conflict, to use conflict as a tool, and to be able to strengthen relationships and make personal and social change using conflict as a tool to do so. Our work is focused on creating restorative culture and restorative practices. And again, that's in schools, it's in workplaces, it's in community groups, and it's within individual homes as well. And I use the word conflict transformation intentionally because, and I have for many years, because to me, it does a couple things. One is it signifies the transformative process that each of us as individuals and as a society and as communities, we undergo in order to make the world we want to see. Like that's transformation is what creates that. And it gives people different access points. So we can all be on a different place in our own personal journey and our collective journey and still have an access point in transformation. And the other reason that I use conflict transformation very intentionally is because conflict transformation acknowledges the systems and structures at play that exist in any society, whatever environment you're working in. There are systems and structures at play. And so conflict transformation says we can look at the patterns of conflict and we can look at the way we relate and engage with one another. And we must at all moments keep the context, the larger context in sight as well, right? What are the systems of oppression? What are the institutions? Who's benefiting? Who's being centered in this conversation or in this design we've come up with? Who's being excluded? And how do we bridge that? So the work for me is really about bringing people together, and it's about connection, and it's about creating space for belonging for everybody. And it's not, sometimes when I say that, people roll their eyes, or, I'm from New England, and there's a way that we talk in the Bay Area. Many of us talk in the Bay Area that's a little different. And, sometimes people roll their eyes, but it's really not about people holding hands and feeling good. It's actually the opposite. It's about saying, so many progressive places, people say, well, we just want to make space for diversity. Well, that's a beautiful idea. And it's hard work. It doesn't just happen because you put people with difference in a space. It's hard work. So to me, it's the work. It's like, can I hang in there? Do I have the personal resource, ability and the community resource ability to hang in there, sit through, stand through, move through the hard times? So I'll pause more of my personal story to bring that in later because I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I just wanted to make sure I kind of shared a little bit about my definitions because I've thought a lot about them, as I'm sure both of you have too. Mm-hmm. It's not by accident.
Yeah, this thing about transformation as opposed to conflict resolution really, I think, is just super important. And appreciate one, because you have to, if you're going to be dealing with the situation, you need to deal with what's at the heart of it. Like think about like the conditions for the conflict are existing. And then, conflict is the symptom. What we think of as conflict, where people get into a fight or they start arguing or disagreeing, that's like a symptom that there's something in the system that's not working. And it's like this indicator that the system has this capacity to change or needs to change. And so I really appreciate, that aspect, but then also recognizing that, and this kind of goes into this idea of like thinking beyond neutrality, that if you're going to go into a system and you just resolve it, like you paper it over, like, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, but you didn't actually address like the underlying causes of the issue, then in a way you're just replicating the problem that's already there or just putting it off for later. And so in certain ways we're just, improving, just like, can we like do this better? And I think that what's really interesting though also is that you need to include everyone. And that isn't just about let's just create diversity or let's just have everyone come together and in the world for every one of us. It's like that means we're all going to have to get into the stuff together, and it will be hard. But then not doing that is not an option, because whoever you don't include is going to come find a way of including themselves on their own terms, and we're all interconnected. We're all here, and so we all have to figure out how to grow together. And there's something about just like that need to be with each other in our interconnectedness that's like really important. And I think that that's part of like what it offers right now, because right now is like, we're dealing with like, we're in the middle of this pandemic, which has this interesting thing. I'll just put a little parentheses here that like, it's interesting that your organization can go from this local to statewide to national, like that the way that the virtual communication has flattened space, has made the world smaller is really interesting that that's happening. But then there's also this thing that we have this like time of uprising of people really speaking out and saying that like the racial systemic issues are not working anymore. So we're in this time of massive transition. And so you can talk about how it's hard work to like get into the transformation, but why is this worth doing that hard work? What's the hope here?
I was just really appreciating Addie highlighting the fact that, and actually both of you, diversity is hard work. Homogeneity is way easier at every level, right? Like we look to some of the Nordic countries, the Northern European countries, and their national policies. And it was like, yeah, in that context, it is easier to do some of those things, right? And so when you bring it down into like family culture, for example, I think about in a family that has, homogeneity on its side, right? Like the dysfunction is familiar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, it's the dysfunction, and
well, it's like the invisible culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so even when you're in conflict, you kind of know what the different players in your families will do and react to, and it's very different when our different dysfunctions come together in a workplace or in a city, in terms of civic engagement, or in a school, right? It's like then we're putting all of our conflict patterns at odds with one another often, but we're not talking about it. And a lot of assumptions are made about why so-and-so is doing what they're doing or not doing, or we fill in the picture with our projections. Like, we start doing all of those things when we bring diversity into the picture, because we actually have very limited information about the assumptions that others are making. And the other thing that I wanted to bring in from what Addie said was, this idea of belonging, to me, belonging and transcendence are the two things that humans have forever grappled with. And often belonging and adaptation / evolution can be at great odds with each other, right? And so if you think of the idea of, individuation that happens in your youth, and what that means for belonging in your family as you're trying to adapt, right, and kind of grow into something. And at the society level, whenever a group of people want society to evolve, they have to create tension, or they have to name the tension that is there that challenges some feelings of belonging. And that is so tough, right? It's like when you start addressing tension with aversion, with these feelings of hate and anger, with like, let's throw things away, right? Cancel culture. Like, when you start addressing tension with that energy, that journey of transformation looks very different.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's almost not transformation. It's just like literally flipping power dynamics from one group to another. It's sort of like throughout history, there's this common pattern of the most oppressed becoming the oppressors. And of course, that's a pretty simplistic, view. And yet it's a real concept. And so it's like, if we actually just take a power-based lens of this group has too much power, therefore this group doesn't belong, we're just going to flip that power, then you just create someone else who's outside of the belonging. So you haven't actually solved much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this, I think, is where the transformation piece comes in, right? That if you're going to keep the same system and just like change who's in charge, then you're just going to continue replicating the system. But if you, in the process, transform the way of being in relationship, then it might look really different afterwards. And again, and this has to do a little bit of just being able to see the invisible culture that you're living in, right? So if you're like, oh, well, there's someone who's going to be in power and they're going to tell us what to do. I want to be the person who's in power and tell us what to do. Well, that's actually, you haven't noticed that. Why are we in a situation where there's someone who's in power and telling us what to do? Well, it makes me want to kind of unpack a little bit. So if we're addressing the system and like dealing with the underlying systemic issues, like in conflict transformation, but also a lot of causes out there right now are trying to address the systemic issues. I mean, the systemic racism is in our our current language. People are frustrated with the political system. What is the difference between trying to attack these systems or resist these systems or undermine these systems versus transform these systems?
$1 million question.
I mean, we could talk about this for months because I think there's so many important differences. So I'll try to just name a couple. And I know E.E. and Duncan, you two both also have your own ways in which there's, you're tracking the differences. But I'd say that the first thing that makes transformation different than just deconstruction is that you are holding visioning as well as just... So it's deconstruction is reactionary. It's like, this isn't working, and so we're going to get rid of this, right? Or whatever. It's very much, it's almost transactional, and it's very reactive. And that's great. I mean, I'm all for the way that social movements in our country and around the world have come in reaction. And sometimes there's a moment in time that needs that. So I certainly don't say that that's problematic. And it can't be all that we're doing. Because otherwise, then again, we just replicate, even if you break down the system, but you just rebuild without the intention of building new culture, new norms, new values, then you just build the same thing in a different iteration. And so I think that for me, the transformation is also, it's like you end up, it's like, it's so much more expansive because you actually can create something different than just in response to what isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
I have so many more, but I'm going to pause and see if he wants to chime in because I know this is a passion place for all of us.
Yeah, for sure. I was just reminded of a colleague of ours, Addie, Eugene Kim. He talks about the me, the we, and the it, and that when you're doing transformative work, you have to engage at all those levels. And that is incredibly difficult, right? To have the intimacy, right? To do inter and intra healing work and still have that big scope of like, I would say like it's the what happens after revolution, right? Like that kind of questioning. It's like, what are we building? Are we just against something, or are we going to actually put our creative power to use, But yeah, just putting everything through the me, we, it is incredibly tough work. And I find that often groups are able to do one or two of those, but really holding all three is tough work. And it takes practice, and it takes skill, and it takes discipline.
I just was re-listening to the interview I did with Kazu Haga, which I used to sort of launch this like new season 3. And it was from 2018, but it was amazing how much it just was like exactly relevant for now. But he talks about Kingian nonviolence principles, and there's these 5 or 6 steps. And one of the things we get into is how like the civil disobedience is step 5. Right. And then it's like after getting informed and educated and, learning about the whole situation. And then step 6 is reconciliation. Right. We all just want to focus on it's easy to focus on the civil disobedience part. Like, let's go out there and raise a heck. But eventually you're going to have to engage with the people on the other side. And Kim, I feel like I just want to put in here. So I've probably talked to both of you about this, but like there's like the 3 rules of conflict transformation. First of all, the conflict's not about what it's about. You have to like find what is the deeper issue here, like what is actually at the heart of it. So this is about analyzing the system, analyzing like why do people really care about this? Like what fundamental issue is this touching in people's lives? And the second rule is that whoever's involved in the problem is going to have to be involved in the solution. So you can't just have one side or another side be the ones who come up with what this new future is going to look like. And then the third rule is that the process and the outcome are the same thing. You have to start thinking about what you want this outcome to look like. Like, what are the values and this future? And I think this comes in here because that seems like what the difference between transformation and deconstruction is like you have to have the visions. Like, what are we building towards? We want to, and that includes, we want it to be inclusive. We want to address these underlying things. But then it's also worth remembering that process, the outcome is just a new process. It's going to be a dynamic new way of living, which brings us to the 4th of the 3 rules of conflict, that there's not going to be a final outcome. If you're going to be in an ongoing relationship, you're going to have to keep on being in conversation, which points out that it becomes more about the process than actually trying to get to some solution. And I think that this is like a huge antidote that people are missing.
Hi, Fractal friends. Sorry for the interruption. I'll keep this one quick. So are you part of a team or a group or an organization? I bet that you are. Actually, I bet that you're part of a few of them. Whatever your purpose is, I know that for you to be successful, you need to be able to count on the web of relationships that hold you together as you work towards your mission. It's hard sometimes to find a balance between being effective, acting decisively, and getting things done on one hand, while also cultivating a safe, caring, joyful, and collaborative environment on the other. But it is vitally important that your group both strikes and sustains that balance between people and purpose. So how's your team doing? Are you getting along? How are you adapting to the changing context that we're all in? Is your team struggling to work together to achieve its life-affirming purpose? If so, I would love to talk to you. In my company, Spoke and Wheel, we call ourselves the workplace relationship experts, and we believe that great relationships are what drive great organization. Whether you're part of a big company or a small startup or something in between, we've got you covered. Or maybe you're part of a group or organization that's working for political and social change. We've got that covered too, through our partnership with Mediators Beyond Borders International. And as a bonus, we are designed to work with remote teams in a 100% virtual environment. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, if you are ready to transform your relationships and get your crew to be happily moving in the same direction again, we're here for you. Come on over to spokeandwheel.co and schedule a free call with us. Again, that is spokeandwheel.co. And now, back to the show.
The conflict transformation is actually talking about process. It's like, here are the tools that can help us be in these difficult conversations in diverse contexts. And so it becomes more about the how than the what, right? Like, we're not just going to get to something like, okay, we fixed it all, and now there's no more racism, or there's no more political division or economic inequality. We all agree. Like, that's not a world that we want to get to necessarily. We're going to be in this dynamic thing, because these problems, as you said, is like, go back deep through history. This question of belonging and transcendence or individuation and community, it's forever. It's always the issue. So there's something about not trying to find like the fixed solutions, but trying to find like dynamic things. And I think that all of us are collectors of processes. I don't know, I would just love to hear a little bit about some like the different processes that you sort of have run into. Because I mean, know that like we all are, mediation, restorative justice, dialogue. I don't know, what do you experience about this concept of like process versus solution?
Well, I think what comes up for me is that it's very liberating. I can share that when I started to feel like I could call myself a process designer because I had learned enough about, on a personal level, I had transformed enough to let go of the need for clean, clear outcomes. And I saw that the massive benefit that created for me as an individual to be able to relate to others and to be able to do things that I cared a lot about, like creating more being better, more of a community-oriented person, some of these things that my values aligned with, but maybe my personal behaviors weren't quite there because of some of the needs I had for more either linear thinking or just like focusing on the outcome. So I found it liberating that way, but I found it mostly liberating because of two things. One is it makes growth a strength. It makes changing, like learning something different and thinking about something differently, actually a strength, as opposed to somehow you've like compromised your own consistency or an integrity. And so for me, that's liberating to think, oh yeah, I get to just like, it's okay. Actually, like it's a strength to change my mind about something or to feel differently about something, because that means I'm growing. And process does that. That's the point of process. Again, you're not trying to arrive somewhere, but you're trying to, so I found it liberating that way. I also found it liberating because it gave me a framework that I could continue to engage my critical analysis in a way that is what I feel is required of us each as individuals in the world. And that is my like responsibility to creating social change, is to have like deep critical analysis, right? Who does each decision impact? Who is included? Who is excluded? Who does it center? Like some of these critical inquiry questions that have been a part of my identity for my whole life and feel very central to my sense of being a responsible human in the world. Like process centers that without me having to take myself too seriously and thinking that I know better than anyone else. So it takes away the paternalistic element that can come with deep critique. So it's like, if I'm asking those deep questions, then am I the person who's supposed to be the expert? Like, of course not. Like, I don't know other people's lives. And especially as someone who comes from relative privilege and was raised that if you have whatever you have, be it material or, I think of it more in terms of emotional resource because of the way that I was raised with certain abundance, like it is your responsibility to make the world better with that. Like, that's just what it means to be a human. Like, without that, you're just not actually living purpose, right? So that's the way I was raised. I still feel that. But if that means that I'm constantly putting myself in situations where I'm making social change in places that isn't my lived experience, what does that mean about, like, I'm not an expert there. So how do you merit? So with process, you get to offer something really practical and pragmatic and partner with people, and they get to be the experts in their own lives and lived experience. Mm-hmm. So it for me, it was the marriage of critical inquiry and humility to make social change.
Mm.
Addie, I really appreciate that you use the word liberation to talk about your experience of doing this work, because this work can be so intimidating, especially when we are, as a facilitator, facilitating conversations about equity and inclusion. It puts people in really tough places emotionally. And I think sometimes that's like the brand image of this work. But, just like you, I have just experienced so much choice, I guess that's what maybe you're saying with the liberation, a choice to show up in a certain way. But also, I feel a lot of fortune in being able to invest in the process work because it requires me to do my work. That in order for me to become a really good designer of spaces of conversations, I've just had to invest in my own like grief work or my own healing and my own self-reflection, for example, just like even being able to deal with unskillful comments, that I sometimes get, right? Because it happens, and so for me, developing a thicker skin without it turning into armor, that's something that I've had the fortune to work on because of this line of work. And I feel like I'm a much better person for it. I'm a better parent for it. I'm a better partner. I'm a better friend. I'm a better daughter. Like I'm just a better human being in my community because I am investing in being like an expert in lived experience. It's like I'm putting myself through the journey of transformation so that when I show up, I know how hard it is for people and that I slow down enough and that I push what I need to, right? Like it's like being there for those moments to dynamically steer conversations, that takes a lot of self-reflective practice.
Mm-hmm.
I always joke, one of the things that you said kind of makes me laugh a little bit. I used to joke with a couple of my former colleagues at my last organization when I was also doing conflict transformation work, that this work is perfect for somebody who wants to be self-involved, but pretend that they're giving to the world. And of course, that's just my, I don't really mean that. That's like my kind of sarcastic, crass side, but it's sort of that concept of like, what a gift that we are required to do our own personal work in service of this work. And then it doesn't have to feel like I'm revolving the world around me, but it's more like I'm going to do this work in service of, collective healing.
Yeah. We get to be selfish, right? In our own healing. Yeah. I mean, I'm really investing in grief work right now. And one of I'm reading Francis Weller's book about grief, and he talks about different gates of grief. And one of the gates is about expecting something that we didn't get, but we don't even know how to call it that, right? And he's really talking about the village. And the irony there is that, because of nuclear family living and the way that modern capitalism has structured consumerism, right, and designed the family unit in response to what made sense for the economy, there is isolation, there's an absence of village, and that we are born with the innate desire and know-how to be in village. But then at some point we realize we don't have that. But because we don't have that, we might not even know that grief is sitting there, right? Like maybe from birth, maybe from our parents who raised us in a nuclear family context and didn't have the support they needed to be the best humans they could be for us, right? And that grief is kind of there. But the irony is that we don't have a village to process that grief with. Right. And so there's this like double-edged thing that we're carrying around. And sometimes that void translates into seeking validation from the external world or accumulating material things, or, it's like trying to fill that void in a way that we best know how, in the absence of guidance and a community that can hold space for us to do that work in. Yeah, so I've been just, thinking hard about the kind of grief that I have as an offspring of parents who grew up, who were raised in post-British colonial country, in those systems where their identities were robbed. I don't even know how to name everything I've lost. I just know that there's loss there.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, wow. So many pieces here that I want to catch and maybe thread together here. And so one is just I want to lift up this idea that by being someone who does process, that you don't have to be the expert on the content. You're just helping with the journey, right? So I don't need to know you, I'll work with some company and I don't need to know how your job works. I'm just helping you have the process to be able to talk about it, right? So there's that. But then there's also this way that liberation of not knowing is wow, what would it be like for me to be someone who is a dynamic human being, right? I'm going to be able to listen to you and be changed by what I hear, right? And then this whole thing of transformation is this can we actually allow ourselves and our communities and our world be in a process of change? And then grief then just is an inherent part of that, because it's this process of letting go of something in order to create space for the next thing. And so whether that's me being like, wow, I believed this my whole life. And now that I've heard what you just said, I'm realizing that, oh God, 40 years how could I have gone so long thinking that? I mean, that's deep grief work that's hidden in that, right? To be able to be like, I'm going to let go of this thing that I've always believed, or this thing that I thought was normal. I mean, and making that culture explicit, or something that's like, wow, I've never done this. But this is that inherent growth that we're in. And so I also just love this idea of just like growth as being like a strength, right? Like I am someone who's going to continually be in a process of growth. But again, it's like you have to something has to die for something to be born, and like very personally, I've just been really thinking about just like, what does it mean to clear the ground to plant new seeds, to take out, wow, that was a really beautiful plant before and now, but like it's dead now. Now I'm going to clear the soil and put something new there. And I think that especially as we're like trying to deal with like problems that are in this world, there's something about bringing the kindness to letting something go. And a lot of times, if you like try to just like force take something out of someone's hands and be like, you can't have that anymore, like they'll fight for it. Like there's something about just as we're in this, again, this like contrast of like, deconstructing systems versus transforming systems, there's a certain, we need to create space for grieving.
Yeah. It's almost like the same mindset of extraction gets applied to change work. It's like the same principle. It's just like, get rid of it, there's an energy there. I was just thinking about this idea of belonging. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but for me, the price of being a dynamic human being has meant I'm that person in my family who's just different. It's like I speak a certain way, I think a certain way. My parents don't understand a lot of my decisions. They don't know why I get involved in things, or why I don't just like have a linear life path. I mean, like there's a cost to my sense of belonging because I have committed to evolution.
Whoa.
And my Angelou has I just pulled it up because I wanted to share that with you. You only are free when you realize you belong no place, and you belong every place and no place at all. The price is high and the reward is great. And sometimes for me, this work of internal transformation so that I can be, I can show up with a spirit of service for social transformation, there's a cost. But the reward is high, so I keep doing it.
By the way, it's one of my favorite quotes. And you did a lot of training with like Brene Brown, right? Is that where you heard that quote first time? Yeah. This idea of that, like when you belong nowhere, like, I mean, allowing yourself to be a dynamic human being is also about knowing what's your authentic self and then knowing what part of you can move, right? There's something like, there's this interesting contrast of like finding your core, like this is my true, and not having yourself be fixed. Because they like often it sounds like this is who I am. You could like sort of, in a way, you could define it and just be like, this is who I am. I'm not going to change for anyone. And then that becomes this like stuck thing. But actually, the brilliance of that quote is being able to, can I just like trust that I am okay and speak from my truth while also being able to be in flow and to be willing to be affected by the world? It's almost impossible to say it. Right? Like it's interesting how it's like hard to even say this like concept. But from that quote where like there were moments in my life where I know that when I was being like kind of in my most authentic expression, whatever it was at that moment, there's a way that I could belong anywhere. Like I'd noticed very much that people in all these different contexts, whereas usually there's no reason I would be there. People would interact with me as though I belong because they saw me being authentic. Anyways, there's great risk to being dynamic human beings. Right? Because in that belonging, people do want to just like create these like fixed boundaries and be like this is, it's hard to be in any part of any cause. Like, I mean, imagine being part of any political or social change thing on the left or the right, wherever, and being able to like, and asking like, are we sure that this is the right idea? Like you might get kicked out. Like, hey, can we like think critically about what her approach is? Like, it's risky. Can we think about how we do last names in our family?
For sure. I mean, I think about, like transgender youth, for example, right? gosh, like homelessness, homicide. I mean, if you just think of how our society responds to someone articulating who they are, right? That says a lot about how much our systems allow for dynamism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, it makes me think that specifically, it makes me think about, again, when we're in reaction mode and response mode versus generative creation mode. And what I mean by that is, I feel like there's this kind of generational norm I've been learning a lot more about in terms of this concept of like showing up as your authentic self. There's a little part of me that actually, when I hear people say that, and even on this call, I start to cringe a little bit. And the reason is because to me, what I'm experiencing is that anything that comes in reaction to something that people don't like is often an extreme that is valuable for that individual and maybe not the culture we want to create in terms of like earlier you're talking about like culture creation. And so like, for example, I'm a first-time executive director, and it's been a huge learning journey for me to figure out how to, you talked about Eugene's kind of framework. The way that I talk about it more is like balancing the needs and considering the needs of the organization, the individual, each individual within it, and the work, right? And so, I've had to have hard conversations when people say, well, I want to show up as my authentic self. And so I can come to work barefoot and and wear ripped jeans or pajamas because this is who I am and the world should make space for it. And thinking about how, to me, being your authentic self isn't that you don't have to be all of you at all moments. Like, it's still okay. It's still important to understand context and impact and the collective. And I think, again, it's just like, it's the same concept we're talking about, which is like, if we're not co-creating while we're reacting, then we just come up with something that serves a moment in time or an individual need and does not actually serve a broader cultural shift or transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really appreciate this like as an example, because, and again, it helps me clarify what I was trying to say before too, because there's something about knowing that whatever the me is untouchable by the world outside of me. And so I can change what I'm wearing, whatever, because that, like, I can change what I'm wearing and how I'm expressing myself and go into this context, talk with this person because I'm fine, right? There's something about like, like I'm going to be okay because I've met myself. I have gone through my process of forgiving myself. I know who I am, so I don't need you to do anything about it, right? And so that allows me then to adapt. Something about like being able to, because it all comes down, I mean, there's the example of like belonging and transcendence, but it's all self and other kind of thing. It's like we have to both be in relationship and be ourself, and those, you actually can't even do both at the same time. You can go back and forth really quickly. So you can, be like, I'm me, I'm with you, I'm me, I'm with you. I mean, even in this conversation, we're all balancing the space that we're taking because we want to hear each other and be in relationship, but we want to express what we want to say, but then I want to make, still stay connected. I could go off on, I had to like think, do I share my 3 rules of conflict, right? It's like, do I want to really put my like thing into the middle of this conversation, and that's the thing is we're like all in this dance together, but then is it of service to you? Is it of service to our conversation? Yeah. So then, so that's always this tension.
What I appreciate about what you're saying, Duncan, is that when you know yourself, right, the external stuff can change,
mm-hmm.
and it doesn't mess with your identity.
Right.
What you consider authentic, like, it's like one might be prone to define certain behaviors or certain ways of being or thinking as self because they haven't actually explored self, right? So when your core identity, your values, etc., the deeper things are solid, some of those external things can shift and you're still you, right? And having to adhere to dress code, for example, at work doesn't threaten identity and belonging.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think what I want to bring into this conversation as another layer of it is, because what you're saying really resonates with me, EE and Duncan, and we all have our different ways of explaining kind of like what is at our core and our grounding and connection to self and connection to others, right? But I think the other layer that I want to bring into this, because it feels to me like it's really relevant to this moment in time in history and kind of the context of our current social political environment, is who has access to that self-transformation, because there are conditions that make it there. That's a very individually, personally resourced space to come from. And for sure, I imagine that anybody can get there despite all the other environmental impact. And yet I'm pretty sure that there's an element of privilege that comes with having the time to think about self-growth in that way, or, having the spaciousness to do that, or just maybe basic things of just like not being exhausted. Like when I'm super, super exhausted, I don't remember those core parts of myself in the same way. Right? If I'm super, super hungry. So I just think there's some interplay here. I just want to make sure that we're not, because I know both of you, so I have a little bit of the privilege of like filling in the gaps. And I just want to make sure that we're not expressing somehow that if everybody could follow a path of self-actualization and personal growth, then we wouldn't have the same, like we'd be doing that's enough of the work in and of itself. And I just want to kind of put back in because I know neither of you think that. And yet for me, and I'm also, this is me being a little bit in response because I see the pushback I get at times for the field I'm in. I've been fascinated over the past year and a half to hear criticisms of this field that is the exact opposite of what I believe the field is about. And it's been fascinating for me. And it's been such a growth opportunity. And I think it's this reaction mode. And so want to make sure that we in our conversation, while we're talking about the personal transformation, that we're still connecting it back and that we're grounding it in, because it's especially matters because of the larger context and the larger systems.
Yeah. I want to see if it could weave this back into our conflict transformation sort of theme here, because everything's all connected. And, obviously love pointing out that conflict is a fractal. So it's happening inside of ourselves. It's happening in our personal relationships, organizationally, nationally, and stuff. So all this is connected. But it's, so if we think about this tension between people wanting to express themselves, or let's just say, or fight for their cause, or, fight for their political party, or fight for their country, we want to get sort of our way of being, and we want the world to adapt to the way that we would like to see it be, right? And then we also need to recognize that we have to do this in relationship with each other, right? So there's something about how what the conflict transformation field provides, as in this is the process and the structure that can help hold this, even when you don't have the privilege to be able to really feel secure in that journey, right? So how this applies to a progressive cause, it's Black Lives Matter wants to very, appropriately raising a ruckus to sort of bring attention to the lack of racial justice in this country, right? And they're going to have to do this in relationship with the entire political spectrum is going to have to eventually get on board to whatever transformations we're going to get into. Now, might not be the security in that community to say wow, I feel totally secure in my authentic expression. I don't need you to change, right? So there is this request for change. And there's something about how the process of bringing in structure and process can help support those who are in these kinds of conversations with their voices. I really think a huge aspect of conflict transformation is balancing power, right? It's a fundamental thing. It's can we get everyone here so that we're all in the same conversation? I don't know. Maybe we think about restorative circle as being this process of sort of creating the structure so that even if you don't feel you're ready to advocate for yourself, we're going to create a space where it's going to be a lot easier for you to do that. So again, this tension of do we want the world to change for us? Do we not want it to, do we change for the world? And then how process can kind of hold all that. I don't know. Does that bring us back home? I don't know.
I keep thinking in our conversation, it's one of the things we've talked about language. There's culture, there's logic embedded into language. And a couple times in our conversation, we struggle to really articulate our thoughts, right? And a part of it is that as conflict transformation practitioners, we think in terms of patterns and systems and relationships and webs. And it's just the mental model we have is very different. And so to be able to articulate the mental model with the logic of English, it's sometimes very limiting. It just doesn't fit sometimes, right? And one of the things that I love is just being able to study different forms of democracy and different ways that people have gathered, or the way that even different languages talk about it. You know, there's an elder, Jeanette Armstrong, who talks about just the language is not so noun-based, right? It doesn't create these silos. It's a very relational, like verb-based kind of language. So the closest word to like democracy, or, you know, that kind of processing, you know, of like conflict and ideas and all of that, translates to slowly dripping water on each other's heads.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that just like a beautiful imagery, right? Like the slowness, right? The slowness of it, and that it's happening, we're doing it with each other, right?
Well, there's a lot of interpretations of that. I mean, from my cultural orientation, that actually sounds like corporal punishment, like waterboarding. No, I mean, I'm serious, right? And I don't know the concept, so I'm not actually commenting on this specific, you know, language and culture, because I have no clue of that. But I think it does speak to what we were talking about earlier in terms of where we're positioned and our own positionality within our lived experience, our cultural norms, or everything, right? That makes up our identity, right? That there's a lot of different ways to interpret it. It makes me think about a time that I dated a gentleman from Nairobi, and his first language was an anecdotal language. So he would often say to me like, oh, well, it's, you know, we'd be discussing something and he'd be trying to explain a challenge he was having. And he'd be like, well, it's like this. And he'd tell me a story and he'd be like, you know what I mean? And I'd say, no, I have no idea what you mean, because the way that I'm going to interpret that story is based on my lived experience and my orientation. And I am going to miss it because I don't actually have any idea what the narrative is supposed to tell me when you're trying to communicate. And so to me, the reason I say this is it comes back to so much of the core of what conflict transformation is about, which is that we are all, as individuals and as whatever part of our identity we're highlighting in that moment, situated from our own perspective. Mm-hmm. And that is beautiful. So what are we doing to actually understand those different perspectives, to understand what we're saying, to understand what both the challenges and the strengths are, so that we can together build something that works for all of us.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, like with that it was Jeanette Armstrong, you said, was the author. I'll make sure, by the way, there's going to be links for all these things in the episode page. But what part of that way of saying democracy like really was interesting to you? Like what was it, the part that touched you when you heard that?
The first part is the slowness of it. And especially in our culture of fast media and combined with the sense of urgency, there's often this like, let's just get to a policy, right? I mean, I think that Duncan, you've talked about like legislating our way out of solutions, right? It's like, have we identified the problem correctly? You know, and sometimes you have to slow down to do that, right? And sometimes democracy, actually, I would say probably always, democracy requires slowing down. And when you combine democracy with diversity, like you need space, you know? So I love that there's the expectation that this is happening slowly. And the other part I love is that there's a structure built in to hold creative tension. So, you know, it works actually with like 4 different like representative groups that are talking about things from different lenses, and that exchange then informs decision. Mm-hmm. And that kind of like whole perspective, you know, the idea that I know better what I'm thinking and feeling by talking to you and hearing what you're thinking and feeling, and seeing your perspective actually informs mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like your interpretation of it much better than mine. It feels much better and more aligned.
So I kind of wanted to go meta here as a kind of a way of also kind of like landing the plane, that, you know, one of the challenges that we have in this field is communicating about why learning how to speak and listen better is going to be important, right? it seems like this obvious thing that seems really helpful, but it's hard to communicate the importance of these quote unquote soft skills. It's hard to demonstrate the importance of learning how to live in conflict, manage conflict, engage with conflict effectively before people are actually in conflict and they feel like things have gotten to that place of hopelessness. And I just want to use this as like an example of like what listening looks like. That there's something about like we can hear UE say this thing that you read in this book, and it's like I don't understand that, and then it's like and then for those who are out there, what would it take to hear someone and be like, I don't understand at all what you just said. Can you tell me what that means to you? And just that very like that even understanding of just like slowing down and just like trying to get a sense of, wait, why is this important to you? I think one of my favorite questions that I've learned in this work is, can you tell me something about your life that will help me understand why this is important to you? Right? And it's like really get to like, you can transform any political conversation by asking that question. And what else do you guys think about all that?
Just wanted to kind of continue that thought of what you're saying, like to both, affirm it from my just own perspective and also to take it to another level, which is that it is slowing down and it's also centering, recentering, amplifying. I don't know the exact right word to use here, but conceptually you'll get it when I say it. Relationship and connectivity to each other. Because we can slow down and go more internal and less collective, or we can slow down and again, that slowness or intentionality, as I like to call it, because I'm somebody who sometimes gets a little activated by the idea that to be told to go slow, because just for me as like a strong-minded woman, there's a little trigger there for me, because a lot of my life I've been told move slow or be quiet or be smaller. And I know that's not what you're talking about it. So I'm reframing it a little bit from the language that fits for my identity, right? Which is more about intentionality, which does require slowing down, but it's not slowing down just because to slow down. It's for the intentionality around it, right? But it's also the recentering of connection, relationship, the web, the community, we belong to each other concept that allows us to ask those questions, Duncan, of like, what about that matters to you, right? Because it doesn't matter, it's like I've done like online dating and stuff, and they always, back in the day, they used to ask like, what's your favorite book? What's your favorite TV show? And I'm like, I couldn't care less what your favorite book or TV show is. I want to know why. What about it gets you passionate? How does it relate to who you are in the world, right? Which is the kind of question that I hear you asking and thinking about, like, if we could apply that type of curiosity to our political system, to any sort of formal system, what a drastically different outcome and process we would be in terms of trying to create, even for policies, even to legislate, we could legislate so much better, right?
Yeah.
Addie, I think this is how we fund the movement, is we create a dating app that asks better questions that lead to better matches, right?
Yeah.
Great. I often come up, as I know both of you do too, with these ideas in my head of like, if I just knew somebody who could like make this app or make this, whatever, I have this great idea, which of course I'm sure at the end of the day, everybody's already had. But I have to say that of all those ideas out there I've thought of, and entrepreneurial ideas and different funding ideas, I've never considered a dating app, never once, EE. So thank you for that expansion of my of my mind today.
Possibility.
Well, shout out to the listeners out there who know how to make an app. We would love to consult with you on helping make an amazing dating app. And I think, I wanted to, well, first of all, there's this quote from Rumi that actually have on my website at Spoken Wheel. You think that because you understand one, you must also understand two, because one and one make two. But you must also understand and. It's easy to like look at the ones and see the two that come from it. But if you aren't looking at the and, like that, it's like if you think of nodes or something, like it's that line in between that we need to be paying attention to. Like when I look at, when I watch politics these days, I'm just like constantly like, what is the quality of the conversation? I don't really care who's winning or losing right now. I'm just like, are they trying to destroy each other? Are they actually trying to get along? And like, I'm not very happy with what I see usually. And we're really talking about this movement of like lifting up the importance of conflict transformation. Like we have huge problems in the world and we have the solutions. And it's not very obvious because not a lot of people see the value of it. Like it's interesting as professionals here, like we joke about how we fund this movement, even though we know there's conflict and we know that we can help. There's not necessarily a lot of valuing of the kind of work that we have. And I really wanted to just make sure that we touch on that because it's this massive supply and demand problem. You know, you have this quote unquote army of like volunteer mediators that will give this work away for free and not able to find enough conflicts in a year to be able to keep them busy. And that's true in every city in the United States, you know, that there's hundreds and hundreds of mediators there. And there's just definitely not thousands and thousands of people asking for mediation. Where can people go from here?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I do want to just clarify one thing though, just for the listeners out there who are connected to Seeds. We don't have a workflow problem currently. So I know you were talking, I just want to be really clear that you were talking more about the field in general. Seeds as an organization is actually, we have incredible amount of business right now. So, you know, and it's always, depending on how you talk about conflict, that can always be a tricky thing to be like, we're so happy to know that everybody's in conflict, right? Like, of course, that's not what we mean, but it's more of like the concept that we've been talking about, which is we know that conflict can be generative, and we are so grateful that people are accessing us to make sure that their conflict becomes generative, right? And so I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. Well, yeah, generally though, as a field, it's a challenge to serve people to see the value of this work, even though those who are on the inside really recognize the value of it. And those on the outside, I mean, see the value of it, but don't necessarily want to put their money behind it. And that's an interesting trick.
I mean, Duncan, you and I have talked about this a little bit with our democracy, politics, and conflict engagement project, that there is, there's behavior change that we're designing for, right? It's like people have a pretty high tolerance for BS, you know, for dysfunction, honestly, in organizations. And sometimes that means they reach out too late for professionals, or sometimes they don't even know that professionals exist. Right? Like they don't know. It's kind of like you kind of put up with everything. And then at some point you call a lawyer. And it's like, no, there's a third way. And just letting people know that we exist as a field and this is how we support, you know, I think we have to do a better job.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think it's very much related to the ways, like who are formal institutions and systems are serving and who they're not. And that's just very real. I mean, the United States is a very litigious society, and we build, I mean, even in the workplace, it's risky to create a restorative workplace. It's legally risky to create literally leaders have to decide to have increased legal vulnerability to have workplaces that center humans in relationships. Yeah. Because that's our entire legal system is built on something completely different. So I think there's like, who knows about it? And there's who benefits from the system that's actually in place. And what does it take to counterbalance that? And it's like, especially, you know, there's so much criticism of like capitalism and the capitalist society we live in. And unless there's very few ways you can run any sort of formal entity in this country that doesn't still have to play by the capitalist rules, right? It doesn't matter whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. It doesn't matter what, like at the end of the day, you're still a business in this capitalist society and you still have to follow labor laws. And our labor laws are based on making sure that individuals and organizations don't have legal vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that doesn't center relationships, people, and restoration, let alone grief and healing. So I think there's a lot of things there. Maybe we need another whole podcast on elevating this field and what some of the barriers are to accessing it.
Absolutely. And it comes full circle back to this like culture design question. You know, it's like what does it look like for you to say like, wow, let me just actually be conscious of what this culture is creating. What is the system that I'm in replicating? Is it working? And how can we make it work better? Right? Yeah.
And who's centered and who benefits and who loses and all the in between.
Yeah.
And if you run it through the me, we, it, often the it is centered, right? Not the individual who needs healing, not the relationship between, it's like, nope, separate the parties. They don't ever see each other again. We moved, people around so that they don't ever have to talk to each other again. There's a grievance procedure file. There's an investigation, it's like separate reports. And yeah, it's like the it and the it is legal risk.
Yeah.
Or product, right? Like part of what has made our organization successful is that we talk about our work as products. Like we talk about the resources we develop and the processes we design as products.
Yeah.
That's what works because that's the framework that the majority of people in this country are following in terms of living in a production-based society.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, while we're there, I want to lift up SEEDS a little bit. First of all, just because they have the most clever acronym ever. SEEDS, Services that Encourage Effective Dialogue and Solutions. And I used to work at SEEDS as well. People want to find SEEDS. How do they find that, Addie?
Come to our website, seedscrc.org. You can also just reach out to me directly. I'm AddieRose at seedscrc.org. And I am, AddieRose is in IE. I'm the executive director there. Yeah, those are the two simplest ways. Yeah. If you Google us, you'll find a lot of SEEDS. I have to say, I love our acronym, and it's hard to find us because the metaphor of SEEDS is beautiful and it's common.
Google SEEDS Berkeley.
Yeah, we'll definitely I'll put the links on the episode page there. And of course, we're in the East Bay, the San Francisco Bay, and, while SEEDS is working nationally, wherever you are, there is a mediation center, an awesome local nonprofit mediation center there that is ready to offer you services. People don't know that this is out there, and, spread the word. If you in a conflict, especially if you're just at the beginning of a conflict, whether it's your neighbor or your boss or your workplace or your family, there are easy, effective ways to get your conflicts resolved.
And affordable.
And not just resolved, but actually finding solutions that work for everyone who's there involved. And there's a ton of people who are passionate about and excited to help share this skill with you. Tell us about your business. How will people find you?
I am at bravenewus.com. And yeah, so there's a contact form there. You can reach out. And of course, you can also just contact Duncan and he knows where to find me.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then I still wanted to ask the question, each of you, like, given your life experience, like, what are something you would invite people to pay attention to as they try to make a better world for themselves and the rest of the world?
The one rule that I started, I don't, maybe it's not a rule, kind of a North Star that I had started living by a few years ago was not to do things I resent. And that for me has meant getting better about communicating my boundaries, which is incredibly hard work. Because I grew up in a family that didn't do those kinds of things and, never learned how to do that in school or anything like that, right? And so it's like finding that anchor to guide me through the storm. Whatever is turbulent outside, that's kind of the thing that I keep thinking about. Like, what can I do in this moment that is not reactive, right? Because often reactive things lead to resentment or something else that I don't want in my life. And so now I just, always think about, like, how can I make decisions that, I can live with later.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking a lot about boundaries, about both how they're just like being clear about what we want and what we don't want. And that, again, Brene Brown says, clear is kind. And it's really important to be able to get clear about that earlier on, before, because if someone's already crossed your boundary and then you're reacting, then that's not very nice for anyone. What are you seeing, Addie?
I'm trying to pick like one profound, because there's just so many elements. I think what's coming up for me right now is just paying attention to the stories we tell ourselves. And to me, that is so important right now, is like, what is the story I'm telling myself, and how does that impact the people around me? Because to me, that's where I get stuck in like binary thinking or either or just like where I start to dig in, is because the story I tell myself is based on my lived experience, and the story you tell yourself is based on your lived experience. And how do we make space to let those stories shift, and both to intentionally shift them where we want them to shift, because we have actual agency in how we build our brains. Like, we forget we have agency in how we build our brains.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that purpose, and for the larger purpose of connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This comes back to like the idea of growth as a strength, like, or just allowing ourselves to be influenced by the world around us. And it's like, stories, it's all stories, but it's interesting how like just even like a certain concept will have a whole story behind it. And what's interesting is the story is like this whole web of things that it's harder to shift, because there's actually a podcast with a friend, Ash Adamson, and she talks about she's like, we talk about design and like designing yourself, but it's like, what is your story of yourself? And if you want to like really make changes in your life, you have to be ready to like go all the way to the beginning of that, and actually change the story, right? Because if you like, like if the conclusion of the story is this, and you want to change that conclusion, well, you don't forget to go actually change the whole story that got you to that conclusion. And she gives the example of being like, I'm an imposter, and I'm not really good at this because I didn't actually go to grad school to study the design things that she had done. And she's like, well, no, I'm actually really good at this. But then she had to go back and retell the story, and she changed the story to, I figured out what I really wanted in my life. I learned how to do this all on my own, was like followed my passion, and I got into this position because I'm really good at what I do. But again, so like there's something about the story, like, like if you want to change what's going on, you actually have to change the whole story all the way back. I love that though. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, she designed her life, right? She redesigned her story and redesigned her life. Yeah. I have this activity that I do with some of my coaching clients, is we put together a change resume, and it's just highlighting how they have responded to change and different kinds of change, and then figuring out the moments when they took change with like grace and enthusiasm, and it led to transformation, and then creating a resume out of that. And that helps them change that story about who they are inside change.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you both so much.
Feelings are mutual.
Thank you for being here on Fractal Friends. And we'll definitely pay attention to that ongoing theme of just what the future of this field is. We know that we could talk about any of these subjects we got into forever, so maybe we'll come back to it.
Duncan, do you have a tagline?
Yeah, we all have a role to play in the whole.
Can we all say that together?
Sure.
Okay, you count.
3, 2, 1.
We all have a role to play in the whole.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Fractal Friends with AddieRose MayerandEi Ei Samai. You can find more content, links, and resources about this episode, as well as other episodes at fractalfriends.us. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter so you can get updates on new episodes and learn more about my work as the Chief Transformation Officer at Spoken Wheel. Also, please consider donating to Fractal Friends with small or large financial contributions, or you can subscribe to become a patron. You can find those buttons at the episode webpage and at the Fractal Friends website. You can find out more about AddieRose and Seeds at seedscrc.org, and you can find EE at bravenewus.com. You can also learn more about me at duncanautry.com. If you like this episode, please take a moment to share it with someone. Text it to a friend, post on Facebook, get the word out there. I'm trying to do my part to amplify the voices in these episodes, and I would love to have your support in spreading the word. And as usual, I'll close this out with a song. The song I want to share with you is called Carry Forth. It's by the Boondock Squad. I'm grateful to J. Theo for giving me permission to use this song. J. Theo, also known as Jean Teodoro, is an environmentalist, proletarian, internationalist, poet, and educator. They were born in Quezon City, Philippines, and now lives in occupied Yalamu Ohlone land, also known as San Francisco. I encourage you to check out their website at jtheo.net. That's spelled JXTHEO.net. And pre-order their collaborative multimedia project, Paper Trail to Freedom. Or you can find all this information at Fractal Friends' website. Thank you so much for listening to Fractal Friends. And remember, we all have a role to play in the whole. Have a nice day.
I done ransacked stacks from the ruling class, the architects' soundtracks that'll liberate the masses. The big payback is greater than a paycheck. No amount for selling out would ever change that. So I don't care at all if I never make a cent. From my rhymes I will find you ways to pay rent. Just trying to hear more than radio stations with the same 20 artists all day rotation. So let's go. I'll take whoever on the road. Let the music take the mode. Play the chords, I will flow. Metal, hip-hop, or soul. I backpack, rap, smooth, Cadillac tracks. Multiple syllable measure me for lyrics I mark on wax. So take note of these facts. I don't mess with the ego, whether the method is legal. The only ethic is serving the people. My people still got up on guns at each other for butter. That's why I deliver a stunner for brothers to find in your work to discover.
We bring it home.
We grind away and bring it home.
And we set it in stone.
Our destiny is set in stone.
For the people we hold.
To carry forth our people's hopes.
To let them go.
We can't delay, so let me go. Yo, you can't stop the night of a hip-hop head. Got vinyl turntables in our own playlist. Not care if the radio never plays this. Nothing new to the bay, full of underground hits. Like guitar chords ring and a bass line thump. With a kick snare claps to these songs we sung. Got barricades to break with my napalm tongue. Till it's a household name. This place we're from, you can find me in ciphers and corners of my street. In the eye of disorder, breaking bricks in the mortars. You find me breaking borders, bridging the gap, G. Till my people escape the traps and face the facts. I stay an asthmatic with a semi-automatic. Go-go gadget flow of magic, fantastic illustration. Freedom sound soul at the map and fold to find a destination. Bring on the envy, the shoulders I carry to find the mind's imagination.
We bring it home.
We grind away and bring it home.
And we set it in stone.
Our destiny is set in stone.
For the people we hold.
To carry forth our people's hopes.
To let them go.
We can't delay, so let me go.
We bring it home.
We grind away and bring it home.
And we set it in stone.
Our destiny is set in stone.
For the people we hold.
To carry forth our people's hopes.
To let them go.
We can't delay, so let me go.
Angry at the things that we can never have. We too caught up on the struggles, blinded by the side of my other half. We stay too focused on our own lives when narrow-sided. We still unfortunate, still close-minded. I see my people living life with strength and hurt. But I also see my people living life without a shirt. Every single day we hustle for cash of any sort. I'm just trying to find a cure. What is wrong?